Blueprint for an Ecological Civilization. Land Care as a Path to Wholeness in an Era of Ecological Collapse. Episode 4. The People of the Dawnland. Part 2. The Wabanaki Kinship. Written and narrated by Stephen Leslie. The Western Wabanaki had a distinct history, language, and cultural identity apart from their neighbors, the Haudenosaunee, historically known as the Iroquois, whose lands lay to the west of Lake Champlain. The original Five Nations, the Tuscarora, would not join the Iroquois Confederation until the early 18th century, were powerful people who lived in large settled villages and had gained a reputation for expansionist tendencies. Known as the people of the Longhouse, the Haudenosaunee were a sophisticated and politically astute people, whose form of governance was said to have served as a template for Benjamin Franklin's conception for developing the Articles of Confederation and the political structures of the new republic. The Five Nations had forged a great and lasting peace that had endured for 6 centuries. This peace did not extend to their enemies. The Haudenosaunee developed a fearsome reputation in battle. They were known to other tribes as the man-eaters and reportedly engaged in ritual torture of captured warriors. Captives who demonstrated stoicism in facing torture were accorded full honors upon their deaths. For all the tribes in the Northeast, taking captives became a form of capital in the ongoing wars with the settlers. Across the region, it was common for captives, both settler and indigenous, to be incorporated into a band to replace family members lost in conflict. The Abenaki were not as formally organized in the pre-colonial period as were their powerful neighbors to the west, but the cultural solidarity shared between all the bands within the Dawnland served as an alliance of mutual aid and self-defense, and served as a precursor to the strategic alliances that would later form during the colonial period. The Abenaki in Vermont enjoyed harmonious relations with the Mohican tribe, who were their neighbors to the south, famously chronicled as the Mohicans in James Fenimore Cooper's 1826 novel. When the pan-indigenous uprising against the settlers known as King Philip's War spilled over into the upper valley region of the Connecticut River in 1675, the two peoples fought side by side. The pre-settlement record indicates that relations with the Haudenosaunee were not always so tense, and that even in historical times, there were occasions where bilateral councils were held and trade between the nations was vibrant. The game of lacrosse is thought to have originated among the Algonquin-speaking people in the Great Lakes region. In historic times, it was played widely throughout the woodland culture as far south as Louisiana. Both the Haudenosaunee and the Abenaki were avid players of lacrosse. The Abenaki kept the fun going year-round by also playing a form of ice hockey. Single lacrosse matches could last for days. The game was taken so seriously it was colloquially known as the Little War, and on occasion, real war between tribes could be averted by taking the dispute to the playing field. The Abenaki did not have the same conception of war as the Europeans. Their word for war is most accurately translated as competition. The competing interests of the various European players in the fur trade fueled rivalries, intensified resource extraction, and ratcheted up territorial disputes between the tribes. Of all the indigenous nations of Turtle Island, the Abenaki found themselves on the front lines of the European colonial settlement project. First contact brought a profound and irreversible rupture with the past and carried the existential threat of total annihilation. When the first settlers arrived in the places they named New England, New Holland, and New France, they described it as a wilderness, even though it was home to several hundred thousand ecologically sophisticated souls. Recent estimates put the western Abenaki pre-settlement population at 40,000 and the eastern Abenaki at 50,000. The impression of an empty land was also a consequence of what has been dubbed the Great Dying, when 75 to 90% of the indigenous coastal populations were wiped out by European diseases, first contracted from Basque and English cod fishermen who had begun plying the waters off the coast of Maine over 100 years prior to the settlement at Plymouth. By the mid-16th century, there would be as many as 300 ships from all over Europe working the area off the Great Banks at any given time, with crews of sailors coming ashore to set up drying and salting camps to preserve the catch. These old world plagues, carried by the seamen, were known by epidemiologists as virgin soul epidemics because they have never been seen in the New World before. Between 1616 and 1619, the indigenous populations of the northeast coastal region were laid low by a viral apocalypse. The first Puritan town on Cape Cod was built on Wampanoag village that had been erased by plague. It has been estimated that in 1616 there were 2,000 Wampanoag people residing in the village that was soon to become the site of the Plymouth settlement. The Puritans interpreted the mass die-off of the indigenous people as an act of their God, who meant that the land should be cleared of natives so that the English could be freed to establish their New Jerusalem. For the natives, they are near all dead of the smallpox, so the Lord hath cleared our title to what we possess. The mortality among them was very great, and increased among them daily more and more. Governor John Winthrop, Plymouth Colony, 1633. As early as 1580, the Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia had already lost half their population to European-born diseases. Overall, the eastern Abenaki bands were reduced from their former numbers by 75% at the time of the settling of Plymouth. The Europeans carried zoonotic pathogens contracted from their domestic livestock. They had developed immunity after a millennia of close association with their cows, sheep, chickens, and pigs. Indigenous people had zero immunity to highly communicable diseases like smallpox, measles, scarlet fever, and influenza. It's not known which of this deadly cocktail was the cause of the Great Dying, but the devastating results are irrefutable. In 2022, at the peak of the coronavirus pandemic, the percentage of the overall death rate attributable to the disease in the US was 5.7%, which was among the highest in the world and the highest of any developed country. This rate of infection was sufficient to cause major disturbances in every sector of societal organization. Imagine a pandemic in which 75 to 90% of all people perished. This must have shaken indigenous belief systems and traditional life ways to the core. We can't overstate the degree of trauma and suffering and cultural displacement these coastal communities suffered as a result. And all this occurred prior to the arrival of the Pilgrims. In the pre-contact world, the world was a forest. The Abenaki did not have occasion to experience themselves as being separate from the pristine sylvan setting, which provided them with everything they needed to live well. From their perspective, they lived in a food forest, upon which they exerted a gentle and beneficent influence. Their origin story reflects their deep sense of relationship with the forest. It relates how the demigod, Glooskap, acting as the primary agent of the creator, formed the first people out of the wood of the ash tree. Glooskap then gave instructions to the first people on how to live in balance. Glooskap had many exciting adventures, like the time he entered into combat with Old Man Winter and rode a whale to the islands in the south to retrieve the fair maiden of summer and so restore balance to the seasons. When considering the pedagogic myths concerning the prodigious feats of Glooskap, one can understand why many Abenaki took readily to the Catholicism taught by the French Jesuits. Like Jesus, Glooskap was the self-actualized firstborn of the Creator, one who acted as the earthly emissary of the Great Mystery. Glooskap had an evil twin brother named Malsum, whose malevolent attributes were not unlike those of Satan. Glooskap also possessed miraculous, superhero-like powers and performed miraculous deeds for the welfare of humanity. The fundamental difference between the two is that Glooskap teaches the traditional way according to natural law, so that we can live in right relationship with all beings in the here and now, whereas Jesus, as interpreted by the Church Fathers, teaches a doctrine of supernatural transcendence of this world, with a promise of salvation in a future paradise. Glooskap was a benefactor who unconditionally loved the people and showed them how to live in a good way among each other and with all their relations in the natural world. With the arrival of the Europeans, their entire world was thrown out of balance. The cultural language of the Wabanaki revolved around relationality with their forest home. When the self-described descendants of Adam and Eve arrived upon their shores in their wooden sailing ships, the original people were still living in this Eden. The people of the dawn lived within this pre-colonial landscape by patterning their cultural practices upon the principle of reciprocity with all the other living beings. They hunted, trapped, foraged, fished, and farmed according to the turn of the seasons. They did not understand themselves as being apart from the living web of ancient forest that cloaked their world. If we could experience even one day of the incredible bounty and biodiversity of that world, it would blow our minds and break our hearts to understand what was lost when the forests were destroyed. It would be difficult for our shattered modern sense faculties to even take in the immense waves of vitality pulsing through the intact primary forest. Contact with wild, unfettered nature can bring you to a higher vibration. When you stand in the midst of an ancient primary forest, you are experiencing a highly evolved form of collective consciousness alive within the land. We can gain some insight into the composition of these primary forests as they existed in pre-settlement times from the records left by colonial surveyors. As they demarcated the land grants for new townships, they created lotting surveys. At every corner or angle of the new property line, they would note any significant land features, including the largest tree in the vicinity. Denominated as witness trees, these silent denizens now speak from the colonial records to give us a picture of species composition from that time. Typically, these surveys will list 250 or more witness trees per township. The record shows that the dominant tree in northern New England was the beech tree, with a forest composition of 40% compared to 15% today, and with numbers predicted to further decline with invasive leaf miner outbreaks compounding the already devastating effects of a fungal bark disease first introduced into the region in the 1950s. Nowadays, there is still an abundance of beech, but it manifests mainly as an understory tree. The mature trees that are stressed with disease reproduce by propagating through multiple root sprouts. The buds of the beech are the least favorite browse of the white-tailed deer. As a result of these factors, the beech sprouts outcompete the shade-tolerant hardwoods. Yellow birch and hemlock were also common in the late stage succession forests of the pre-settlement northern woodlands. Chestnut, butternut, maple, hickory, walnut, basswood, ash, cherry, and a host of other species were highly significant, but none were predominant species in the mixed hardwood forests. Early succession trees, such as poplars, birches, and white pines, were not as prevalent then because disturbance was a relatively minor factor compared to our era of colossal upheaval of ecosystems. The once ubiquitous chestnut, with its ability to produce an abundance of sprouting suckers from residual roots similar to its cousin the beech, became much more numerous in the secondary regrowth after settlers cleared and subsequently abandoned farmland. Chestnut trees reliably produce mast every season. As such, the highly nutritional nut was a dependable mainstay of indigenous people and later became an important food source to the Scotch-Irish and German pioneers who settled the Appalachians from Georgia to Maine. Several species of oaks were prevalent in the southern tier. Spruce trees were scattered throughout, but were generally predominant at higher elevations and in the northern latitudes of Wabanaki territory. Although abundant in the river valleys, white pines were a rarity in the pre-settlement uplands. The prevalence of pines in the river bottoms may have been associated with indigenous annual agriculture, wherein early succession species, like pine, would have been first to move on to fields intentionally returned to forest for renewal. In our era, maples have assumed the role as the majority tree species once occupied by beech. Anthropogenic burning favored mast-bearing species that had thick bark and could tolerate drier conditions, such as oaks, hickories, and chestnuts, as well as pines. Once the burning was discontinued, a process of mesification set in, whereby the forests gradually became wetter and denser, favoring species more tolerant of damp soil conditions, such as maples and hemlocks. The ancient forests were populated by a staggering abundance of biodiversity. Anadromous fish, such as Atlantic salmon and shad, were a vital part of the food web, delivering nutrients from the ocean into the uplands as they returned to spawn. Robert Beverley, writing in 1705 from the new settlement in Jamestown, spoke of the large numbers of fish that traveled up the rivers. In the spring of the year, herrings come up in such abundance into their brooks and fjords to spawn that it is almost impossible to ride through without treading on them. Constructed within the Ashuelot River in Swansea, New Hampshire, there is a V-shaped fishing weir that was in continuous use for over 3,000 years. It was known as the Indian Dam by early settlers in the area. Mountain lions and wolves were apex predators. The landscape supported elk, caribou, deer, and a wide variety of fur-bearing mammals. Turkeys, partridge, and numerous waterfowl populated the forests, fields, and waterways. Passenger pigeons darkened the skies with their annual migrations. At the time of first contact, the indigenous people were still co-evolving their culture within this thriving landscape and moving toward greater complexity of relationship. Western culture has typically described such cultures as primitive. In reality, the ecological literacy and nuanced sophistication of the indigenous agro-biodiverse ceramic woodland societies that existed here for at least 1,000 years was nothing short of a supreme collective human achievement. Many of the earliest colonial agricultural settlements were made in the fertile bottomlands of the river valleys that had been the former planting grounds of the indigenous people who had been annihilated by disease. The settlers called this newly occupied land the Old Fields, which is exactly what they were. For 1,000 years, people had been growing corn, squash, and beans in the rich alluvial soils of the Connecticut River Basin and the other major watersheds in the region. It is estimated that at the time of first contact, the people of southern New England obtained 80% of their food calories from the cultivation of maize. In the 1600s in Northern Europe, famine struck about every 20 years. There is no evidence to suggest that indigenous communities experienced any widespread famine, at least not until the post-settlement period. Unlike their European counterparts, the territorial boundaries between Abenaki bands was fluid and non-linear. There were long-standing agreements surrounding the sharing of resources, which could fluctuate depending on availability and with changes in the season. The division of territories was not fixed and rigid, as all the bands had a sense of shared kinship among them, which continues even to this day. The territorial boundaries of the bands were characterized by the natural parameters of watersheds. This form of societal organization, rooted in the ecological reality of place, prefigured the social ecology movement known as bioregionalism. One's sense of home was intimately linked to the presence of the ancestors. Place names were often based on the ancestral and seasonal use of the land as reflected in oral history. Both practical knowledge, such as this is a good place to fish, and stories, such as this is how Glooskap built the first fish weir and then taught the people how to live in balance by returning a portion of his catch to the sea, were embedded in place names. Stories could be humorous and edifying, magical or mundane, but always they were treated as something sacred, as if they had a life of their own. Western people tend to denigrate oral traditions as somehow inferior to their written record, but for people who rely primarily on the spoken word for the transmission of cultural knowledge, the powers of listening and memorizing are extremely well developed, and stories are passed on for generations with stunning accuracy, and yet with a built-in creative plasticity so as to remain vital and relevant for each generation. For instance, when the Nez Perce tribal members claim that they have always had horses, we must keep in mind that their cultural memory extends back to a time 7,000 years ago during the Ice Age, when the ancestors of the modern horse were still roaming the North American continent. At first, the French occupation of Quebec and the maritime provinces was based solely on entrepreneurial extraction. The French adventurers did not come to settle. There were no women among them. Mostly young men of little circumstance, the New World afforded these runners of the woods unbounded opportunity. The French traders and trappers readily adopted indigenous clothing and survival skills and freely intermarried into the tribes. At a time when tribal band numbers were decimated through disease and war, able-bodied men who could hunt and make war were welcome. Many of the descendants of this cultural mix are now recognized as the Métis people. From the very start, the English settlers came with a colonialist project to occupy and settle territory. Women and children arrived in the first boats. Within 10 years after the founding of Plymouth, there were 1,000 English living in the settlement, and by 1650, the population of Massachusetts Bay Colony had boomed to 25,000. As the English settlements expanded, farmers made little to no effort to fence in their livestock. Particularly egregious was the practice of allowing swine to run loose and fatten themselves on whatever forage they could find out on the land, which often turned out to be the corn, squash, and beans ripening in the native people's fields. The wild hogs and cattle caused environmental damage and consumed indigenous mainstays from the forest, such as mushrooms and the mast of nut-bearing trees. Both the English and the French relied on their indigenous partners in their resource extraction ventures. Abenaki people were rewarded with trade goods for supplying furs and for guiding Europeans into areas where valuable wood products, such as white pines for ship masts, could be easily harvested and transported. Even though the English were aiming to set up agricultural settlements, the fledgling trade in beaver furs represented a quick way to accumulate capital. Even the original pilgrims were expected to immediately generate profits to pay off the creditors who had bankrolled the voyage of the Mayflower. The Massachusetts Bay Colony set up by the Puritans was initially not so much a governing body as a corporation for organizing the lucrative fur trade. Indigenous trappers and guides were paid with European trade goods or their equivalent value in wampum beads. Traditionally, wampum belts held ceremonial value. The fabrication and gifting of belts was a means of chronicling important social events and marking agreements between parties. The Dutch and the English monetized wampum so that it began to hold symbolic value as currency. An indigenous trapper would be paid for pelts with wampum beads that could later be redeemed for goods at a set value at a trading post. The manufacture of white and purple wampum beads itself became a lucrative trade for coastal tribes who had access to the shells of whelk and quahog clams. For bringing in beaver pelts and other valued furs, indigenous trappers were paid with iron pots and pans, glass beads, bolts of linen cloth and wool blankets, knives and hatchets, and perhaps most crucially, muskets. Prior to colonization, armed conflict was conducted with spears, bow and arrows, tomahawks, and war clubs. Advances in European firearm technology were continuous. In order to maintain a balance of power between rival tribes competing in the fur trade and to effectively resist settler land grabbing, acquiring firearms became an existential necessity for indigenous people. The English had a firm policy of not trading in muskets, and more often were involved in efforts to take them out of the hands of native people. Such mandates were partially responsible for touching off the conflagration of King Philip's War in 1675. The French, however, made military alliances with the Abenaki and freely traded in firearms as a way of weaponizing their indigenous partners against the English. Beginning in 1634, the Jesuits established missions in New France and became agents in the fur trade and in fomenting a religious war against the Protestant English settlers. Abenaki communities in proximity to the English settlements made accommodations with them, but the majority came under the sway of the French as trading partners and allies in war. As early as 1609, the Abenaki and other Algonquin-speaking tribes in Canada were making pacts with the French explorer and entrepreneur Samuel de Champlain, with whom they traded beaver and whom they cleverly coerced into becoming a valuable ally in taking the fight to their enemies, the Mohawk. They at once saw me and halted, looking at me and I at them. When I saw them making a move to shoot at us, I rested my arquebus against my cheek and aimed directly at one of the three chiefs. With the same shot, two of them fell to the ground, and one of their companions who was wounded and afterwards died. The Iroquois were much astonished that the two men had been so quickly killed, although they were provided with arrow-proof armor made of cotton thread woven together and with wood, which were proof against their arrows. This frightened them greatly. Seeing their chiefs dead, they lost courage and took to flight, abandoning the field and their fort, and fleeing into the depths of the forest, whither I pursued them, and laid low still more of them. The place where this attack took place was named Lake Champlain. Samuel de Champlain, 1610.